kind of control thing, the pitch that we were getting from the young entrepreneurs in their booths. So you can't really walk the floor and be pitched to again and again, or your time will all be stolen away from you and you won't actually end up learning anything. So we flipped it around on people in the booths. We would walk the floor and we'd approach the booth and we would say, hey, do you want to play a game? And usually they would. And we'd say, this will just take 2 minutes of your time. We kind of switched the power dynamic on them and controlled their pitch.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Sales Enablement Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Paul. Joining me today as my guests are Susanna Camp and Jonathan Littman. They are the co-authors of an interesting new book titled The Entrepreneur's Faces: How Makers, Visionaries, and Outsiders Succeed. So yeah, it's a book full of compelling stories about entrepreneurs. But what struck me was really a guide for personal development, specifically for sales professionals, not surprisingly, given I look at things through that lens quite often. And as sellers, we are all mini entrepreneurs in how we manage our sales territory. And in our conversation, we talk about what Jonathan and Susanna call a fresh, human-centered model for transformation. And we dive into why it's essential at the start of your journey to truly understand who you really are and what other types of people speak to you and the challenges you help solve. And this is so true for sellers. Who are you? And we dig into how the entrepreneurs whose stories they profile symbolize what they believe is a revolutionary movement and how people today can take charge of their lives and their careers, and how you too can take proactive steps to take charge of your life and your career. We get into this and much, much more. It's a really fun conversation. But before we get to Susanna and Jonathan, I want to remind you to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to it. And if you subscribe, we'd certainly appreciate it if you could also give us your feedback about how we're doing in the form of a review. So thank you. All right, let's jump into it. Jonathan, Susanna, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Andy. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Andy.
It's my pleasure. My pleasure. So this may sound like deja vu, but where have you been sheltering during the pandemic?
We're near San Francisco, right near the Golden Gate Bridge, over in Marin County. We're not going into San Francisco very often. This little crisis we have lately.
Yes, I've heard of it. Yeah. All right. So here's the question I'm going to ask all my guests recently, and we'll get an answer from each of you. So what's the biggest lesson you've learned about yourself during the pandemic? We'll start with Susanna.
Thank you. Great question. We actually started a group called the Reset Club. We took a cue from Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who tweeted one day about how the pandemic was forcing a total reset, personal, professional, and financial for all of us. So we gathered some of our friends and colleagues from our network and set up a monthly Zoom call with them to talk about how we are resetting our lives and our professional careers and our outlooks during this time. And it's been wonderful. We start with a prompt and we have had some great conversations.
Well, so for you, what do you think that reset will be?
I've been studying instructional design. I'm getting a certificate at Harvard Extension. So I have been thinking a lot about how we are all teachers. It's not just the teachers in front of the class or even the instructional designers creating the digital courses, which I've been doing. There were many, many opportunities to create lasting, enduring understandings that really help people to change their lives and keep learning as lifelong learners. And writing is another one of those things for me, ways that you can teach.
Well, and I think that, at least I believe this is true in sales. I think it's always been the case, but it certainly, I think, is more pronounced now, is this, to your point, is this need for becoming a continuous lifelong learner. If you're not, you are going to get left behind.
Yeah, indeed.
And how about you, Jonathan?
Well, we had this little thing where we were actually up in Lake Tahoe and suddenly shutdown of everything. And we had a book, which we were coming toward finishing, The Entrepreneur's Faces, our new book. And the expert told us, you can't publish in a pandemic. Just forget it.
Because why?
Because
people are at home. What do they have to do but read?
Well, because there was an election. You might have heard there was an election coming.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of times people will say no. They'll tell you not to try a new way to sell something. They'll tell you to wait. And we decided we would go ahead. We actually discovered to our, joy that more companies have been started in the last 4 months than the last 13 years. It's a huge amount of new startups and new businesses. And it's actually a great time to be publishing a book about being entrepreneurial. And our book really is not just for entrepreneurs. It's actually for salespeople and people who have a new product they need to get out in the market.
Well, but to your point about the reset, Susanna, is I think this is an interesting time for people to take stock. And a lot of the lessons I think in the book are, it's a book about entrepreneurs, or a book about personal development in the guise of stories about entrepreneurs, because I think it applies pretty widely in terms of how you take stock of who you are and what's going to bring you happiness and fulfillment and challenge going forward.
Yeah, it is, Andy. It's a lot about the entrepreneurial mindset. How can you kind of approach your life or your career or the task at hand with a kind of experiential learning by doing.
Mm-hmm.
So all of the entrepreneurs in our book had to wear multiple hats, as entrepreneurs do, kind of switching back and forth between salesperson to business development to leader and manager to everything else that they need to do to kind of keep things going while building a team to help fill in those roles with other people.
Well, I think it mirrors to some greater degree these days than perhaps before is challenges just facing people during the pandemic, right? Is if you're a young couple of young kids, school-age kids at home, and you both have jobs, and suddenly you've become a different type of business person. You've become an educator. You've become, these other roles certainly got thrust upon you, and it requires a different perspective.
And tech support.
Right.
There's a lot of
tech support, right? I forgot about tech support, right?
And we have to sort of break out of these old traditions, right? So if you find your office is now your home, you've got to come up with actually new rituals and new habits. We think there've been a lot of bad habits that we know we've acquired, and part of our reset club was searching for better habits and better techniques. And one of the things we really believe in is connecting with other entrepreneurial-minded people, because then you may find ideas for your new offering, this new product you have, because you're getting outside of your bubble, which now actually might be your living room.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And for many people, I think it is. Yeah. All right. So just so we let people know, we're talking about your new book titled "The Entrepreneur's Faces: How Makers, Visionaries, and Outsiders Succeed," and we just profile 10 founders sort of moving through these 7 stages you identified that entrepreneurs sort of pass through in order to bring their ideas to fruition. And as I said, I really enjoyed the book because I read it less as a book about startups and more about personal development, transformation to some degree. And I think everybody's sort of confronting that idea now. And to your point are we going to go back and sort of resume, sort of the same habits we had before, or are we actually going to do something different?
I think we're going to do something different because we are. And because, we can see this is a 1.5 to a 2-year to a 3-year, phase of this crisis. And
could very well be, right?
Right. And so habits change during that time. And the big thing we discovered here is Susanna and I both were seeing this growth in startups in San Francisco. And we realized there wasn't one kind of entrepreneur. And we actually traveled a lot in Europe, 15 different countries. And we found these different types. The one that's probably has something to bear very directly with a sales angle is the evangelist. But we have other great types which we think bear. We call the maker, the prototyper. We have a type we call the athlete.
Yeah, the maker prototyper is, of course, very needed right now during the pandemic, because they are the ones who will prototype new things. We've seen all kinds of new products being developed right now from the new pain points that are popping up everywhere.
Yeah, well, it's certainly, to your point about growth in startups, I mean, there's always sort of this correlation, I think, that over time with extra economic disruption that frees people up to become entrepreneurial, right? Because quite frankly, there are a lot of people that lost their jobs, furloughed or whatever.
It's maybe the only path, right?
Yeah. Well, it has, and I think for to your point about startups, is people doing that, instead of being a gig worker at some sort, is take control.
Well, actually, we saw this in Portugal. We spent a lot of time in Portugal the past couple of years and became really close to many people in the ecosystem there. And I think that the U.S. and other countries could take a tip from Portugal in terms of starting off people with an entrepreneurial mindset. They, of course, had to do it during their last financial crisis in 2011 or so. They actually were under austerity measures. Right. They had the European Union overseeing their financial status for a while. And that from that time, a lot of an entrepreneurship took root. The entrepreneurs found that one thing that they could do was take their unemployment money as a lump sum to seed their startups. And so a lot of new companies were born, and a whole new movement in entrepreneurship that's still going strong today, especially now in the pandemic.
Yeah, and I would imagine we're seeing some of that here in the U.S. with people with the checks that came from the government as well. So a question for you is because a lot of this, we talk about entrepreneurs, the talk invariably sort of trends toward this idea of what success is. So for these entrepreneurs that you profiled, what was success? Because I think this is another thing that is a sort of result of the outgrowth of the pandemic, is sort of redefining some of these sort of fundamental terms we sort of talk about, because life has changed so dramatically. Do we define success differently than we did before?
I think it's a great question. I think in our 10 entrepreneurs, we didn't want to just have 25-year-old, billionaires, right? We
right. You didn't either.
No, we didn't. Although many of them are very successful, even in monetary terms. I think they're all successful in that they were bold and they had something they believed in. We have everything from a sort of restaurateur who created the largest food truck parks.
Right, in San Francisco, right?
In San Francisco, in the world. Very entrepreneurial. He's actually a conductor, a platform builder. He doesn't actually own a single restaurant, right? He created this platform. And we have a young woman who, gave up a great career in TV at like 25, and then went to Singularity, also here in the Bay Area, and was inspired to create really the first global platform to be able to work anywhere in the world, to simplify the whole visa and hiring process.
Right.
And I think the beautiful thing of these 10 individuals is they had a dream of a specific product. One guy got fired, which we've kind of talking about this with the pandemic. He found himself on the street one day. It really happened that fast, and he was a vice president at Deckers, a big shoe brand.
Right.
And he had this dream of a different way of working, which we actually would advise people to check out. It's called a fluid stance. And he dreamed up this board that you can stand on, a balancing board, while working. And it's not a toy. It's very advanced. And we could talk later, but he had to do some amazing sales to make this happen. And I think in each of these 10 stories, the thing that separates them is they just threw themselves into these new products or businesses. And that's really what the success was. There was monetary success, but the success was, it was so fulfilling, the journey itself.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think the reinvention portion of it really is to your point, is what's fulfilling. I mean, I look at my own career as I've sort of laid out maybe 7 or 8 sort of major reinventions throughout the course of the career. Largely, first half largely in tech in the Valley, and every new company I went to was completely different product, different industry, different. I had to fundamentally change what I understood about customers and selling and the products and the technology and so on. And I think that this is, you had Whitney Johnson on the show. We talk about personal disruption, and I think this is sort of a piece is that how people sort of have a hard time, I think, taking the risk, taking the plunge. I was wondering what you saw with these people that was sort of in common in terms of their willingness to sort of risk it all.
Well, I think so. We've been talking about the satisfaction of the personal journey and of this kind of lifelong learning, if you will, and the fulfillment that comes from that. But there's also a meeting the customer's needs that is another level of satisfaction, where people are out there, they're prototyping and iterating and changing their product to meet those demands of the customer's needs. They're filling in people to take roles to actually help to have a more diverse approach toward what the customer wants. And so, because if you build your own company by yourself, all around to the idea of meeting a customer need, it's probably not going to reflect a very diverse base of customers. So you kind of need the other team members to help you reach other pockets of users, and that feedback itself can be very fulfilling when you kind of know that you're serving your community of users, you're serving your network of partners, and also your team.
Yeah, and let me jump in. We
Sure.
About a fifth of our book is set in Stanford. I think you maybe went to this university.
I've heard of it, yeah.
Right, and it's in the D School, which is the design school, which was founded by the IDEO founder, David Kelly. I wrote a couple books in the past with IDEO. And salespeople would love this part of the book. I think they might love all of the book, but this accelerator there is called Launchpad, and it's a college class. It's 10 weeks, and $500 million of value of companies have come out of this college class in 9 years. And the reason is they prototype selling. It's very interesting because a lot of accelerators are prototyping, pitching, right? The idea that you just pitch and you get money and there's a happy ending. And we all know that's kind of a fantasy most of the time.
Yes.
And this professor, his name is Perry Claiborne, had created a company, a real product, and he really loved
snowshoes, right?
Yeah, a crazy thing, snowshoes. But he loved selling, and he loved figuring out, the key value for a customer, and then prototyping the price, the proposition. So, we got to attend this for 2 years, this incubator. And really what astounded us, it was so different from other accelerators. You've heard of the famous Y Combinator.
Sure, 500 startups. All those, yeah.
Here, he would make college kids who really couldn't sell anything, right? They couldn't sell actually lemonade, and they actually have a whole exercise where they have to sell lemonade, and they figure out if they create a better proposition, they can make thousands of dollars in an hour selling lemonade, right? So it's one of the greatest incubators for selling probably in the world, because they take this maker mindset and really think deeply about your customer and how you're going to sell.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's one of the ironies, I think, in my mind, of I'll just sort of say broadly, sort of the SaaS business is that so many of these companies are started in order to fundamentally disrupt the markets that they serve, and yet when it comes to past the innovation stage and past the beginning stage, there's actually becoming more of a company and trying to create predictable revenue streams, is that they basically default to selling the old-fashioned way. And I find this so curious, right? Is that companies that are dedicated and created this idea of disruption default to using sort of these really rigid, compliance-oriented sales processes that had they thought or tried to use them at the front, it would never have succeeded. It becomes sort of anti-entrepreneurial, and I don't know if you have any insights on that. It's just sort of an observation. It's just like it's crazy to me.
We do have some insights in that. At least I do. I think we do together. That sales, it can't be an afterthought. It can't be the thing, like you can't dream up a great product, but not think about how you're going to get it to market and how you're going to get it out there to customers. We found that when we went to trade shows, like say CES or Web Summit, one of the biggest tech trade shows in Europe, we wanted to kind of control the pitch that we were getting from the young entrepreneurs in their booths. So you can't really walk the floor and be pitched to again and again, or your time will all be stolen away from you, and you won't actually end up learning anything.
Right.
So we flipped it around on people in the booths. We would walk the floor, and we would approach the booth, and we would say, "Hey, do you want to play a game?" And usually they would, and we'd say, this will just take 2 minutes of your time. We kind of switched the power dynamic on them and controlled their pitch. And so what we would do is ask them 4 questions. And these questions would, if you think of sort of a quadrant, right, with a letter in each one.
Right.
First letter would be C for customer. Who's your targeted customer? The next quadrant is P for pain. What is the pain that you're trying to solve? These are obvious startup questions, right? Sure. What's your sort of special sauce, the core magic of your product, and what that they can't live without? But then in that 4th quadrant, sales. How are you going to get it to people? How are you going to achieve sales fast? And this is the question that often would make them kind of fall down. They would say, "Oh, well, we're going to sell to corporates," or, they just didn't know. They didn't have it worked out.
Yeah, it was amazing. It was just missing. It was just they had no strategy. And as you point out, no innovation, enterprise customers will just buy our product.
Yeah, I've heard that dream many times. Well, yeah, I think that there's a process innovation demand. I think that there's a lot of talk about how buying behaviors have changed, and they have, certainly to some degree. Inarguably, they have. Not perhaps as much as some people think, because quite frankly, humans aren't evolving measurably over a 25-year period in the way they process information. But we get these innovative products people want to bring to market. Oftentimes, as I said, in the most sort of cumbersome way. It's like, all right, if buying behaviors really have changed, don't we need to fundamentally change how we approach those customers and deal with them as they go through their process of making a decision? I don't get too far off the mark, but in the conversation, that part is ripe for innovation.
Yeah, I'll just mention another character in our book, Alan Young. And Alan Young is a guy we call a leader, and he attended Seth Godin's alternative MBA program. And Seth Godin is one of these creative people I think you're talking about, where Alan was really learning about how to create buzz and how to market, and ultimately about sales. And so after going through this 9-month program, which was free, but he had to be like, one of 1,000, a 10 of 1,000 people who wanted to get in. He got into Y Combinator, not because he believed in the startup that was joining, because he wanted to learn their model. And then he created his own incubator, and he actually kind of sold, space in the incubator by creating buzz.
Mm-hmm.
So he had free events for all these, international entrepreneurs and people coming to the city. And in 3 months, he had 300 entrepreneurs there. I think he had 80 different startups. And it was called Runway. It was in the Twitter building. He did the same thing with getting investors, for this process. And after he did this model, he actually created a different incubator, which was all about sales, because he realized that, when startups start to prove out their tech, they do need more people. They do need to sell. So he created a completely different incubator around selling. And I think that is still missing in the world, that there's a stage that a company moves to where it's really about customers and customer acquisition, but there isn't a really good creative, support for that yet in the world.
Well, I think where the gap exists, and I think where the innovation demand is we've used technology very effectively to create demand at sort of the top of the sales funnel, if you will, and to get that initial level of engagement with potential buyers. Where the gap exists and where the problem exists is from that point to actually getting an order. And the way that takes place today is virtually the same as it was 100 years ago. It doesn't matter. This is through tech companies everywhere. That process of helping the customer understand what the problem is they're trying to solve and helping them understand the alternatives and choose the one that's going to help them sort of achieve their vision of success, virtually unchanged in 100 years. And this is I think, a problem, because in so many of these, certainly the tech startups where I've got a lot of familiarity and experiences, is great products, but very ineffective in the way they sell.
Well, it's a great point. I think what we find with our research is that often innovation and entrepreneurship can be limited in key elements of business. And obviously, we haven't seen the same kind of innovation with sales as we have with design, as we have with product development. Innovation and entrepreneurship is not universal, right? And I think you're hitting at something really important. There hasn't been the same creativity and innovation in sales as there have been in many other elements of startups. And I think it's ripe, and there's a lot of opportunity, and people like yourself and I think many of your guests hopefully are working at this. We'd say that our type, the maker type, and Susanna happens to be a maker here, is a great type to start prototyping some of these new sales approaches.
Yeah. Well, I would go back to a comment you had in the book, which I really liked, and is in your awakening section, sort of the first of your 7 phases, is you talk about this as adopting a mindset of discovery, but you say it's about character too. And I want to explore that because I think we spend way too little time talking about the importance of character in business. And so tell us what you were thinking about when you were writing that.
Well, we're thinking about, we wanted to give a model to people that was missing. We kind of had empathy for our entrepreneurial community. Prior to our book, the Lean Startup was sort of, and still is, the kind of a Bible for people in terms of product-centric approach to entrepreneurship. Of course, Business Model Canvas is another framework that people can get around. But we felt that what was missing was the human-centric approach, the model that would bring people narratives to learn from and archetypes that they could study and embrace after they found their own. So that's kind of self-awareness of what are you good at? What are you maybe not so good at? Where do you need help? This is how you build a team of a strong, diverse team to really get your venture moving and keep it successful.
Yeah, we were actually talking actually on another podcast the other day on a similar topic to someone who saw themselves as a visionary, which is one of our 10 types. And he was expressing sort of his frustration that his partners would think that he would talk too much and was sort of wasting their time with his visions, right? In meetings and in prototyping and brainstorming. And I think when you start to find your archetype, I'm the athlete type, for instance, you also start to have empathy and understanding for the other types. And you start to realize what you're missing, and you're better at listening to the other types. So you're willing to listen to the visionary because you know they have this potential of a breakthrough and a new model that really isn't in your bandwidth, right? And I need the maker here, Susanna, because I can't do these quick prototypes. I might have an idea for one, but I can't do the tinkering and the hard work to test it. And when you go back to this question of character, I think there's just a lot of power in finding your type or types, and it's okay to be a hybrid, and accepting that and sort of going full in with who you are, but also realizing who you want to partner with.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, we don't go through life alone for sure. And whether that's, as a salesperson, whether that's a mentor you find or a peer that can help you. But you talked about, makers and so on. I think in sales, everybody's sort of forced to some degree to be sort of a maker, because this idea is that you have to constantly experiment. And I think this is where the stagnation I see, at least in the sales field, but also see in business oftentimes, is this lack of a willingness to really experiment. I mean, I have this one of the favorite quotes from Ralph Waldo Emerson that I refer to frequently, which was, all life is an experiment. The more experiments you make, the better. And I think that really captures it to a large degree. And I think also through the stories of the 10 profiles, 10 archetypes, your 10 entrepreneurs is they all experimented a lot. I think they all pivoted, and fairly significantly at one point or another as well, which is, I think, is for me, this sort of gets back to character and resilience and so on. Is that you're going to have these challenges, but keep experimenting and be prepared to pivot.
Yeah, and when you come to sales, so one of our great characters is a fellow named Uwe Diegel. He's actually a little older. He was going through this certain phase in his early 50s. And he had this great new product, and he'd always had success with Kickstarters. And it was a sort of health-related product. And he failed in a Kickstarter. So here you have a sales, effort, complete failure. And he realized why it was a failure, because it was a product to help people with a disease, which is something that really hadn't succeeded ever in Kickstarter. It was, quite a serious medical product. So instead of licking his wounds, he jumped on an airplane and he went to this famous web summit, and he entered a contest. There were 1,000 startups in it. And he didn't even know there was a prize, but he got on the stage. He shook Al Gore's hand before. I mean, this is what a big event it was. Al Gore was, the keynote speaker. There were 12,000 people in the audience live, right? And thousands more outside. And he gave this amazing pitch, and he won 50,000 euros. He didn't even know. And he got this big contract. So here you have a guy who failed in his prototype, his experiment, right?
Well, didn't he have a little more drama than that?
He did. He had plenty of drama.
He had a lot of drama, and he's the character we call the evangelist, and an evangelist really knows that you can't just tell a story about your launch or tell a little story about who you are. There has to be drama. There has to be conflict. And he knew this from the get-go with his pitch, which was why it was such a winning pitch. He was able to move people's hearts around the idea that this product that he had made was actually developed for his brother, who was a diabetic.
Right, it's a refrigerator to carry medicines.
Right, right. He had his insulin frozen by the hotel staff at somewhere where they were staying. Mm-hmm. And so they needed to create a product that was for people like him, or also just people who had chronic diseases and needed refrigerated medicine. So that's what it was a mini fridge. But he really got that that the story is really one of the most important ways to sell the product.
Yeah, and he built up this company years before, thinking about the story of it, years before he'd actually be able to even sell it. Mm-hmm. And we actually call him Mr. Cool because he makes these refrigerators. Right. And Mr. Cool is now coming to the rescue actually for COVID. And creating refrigeration to carry vaccines as we speak, because he has different products that cool. So his bags will be carrying vaccines in a few weeks around Europe. So he's a pure storyteller salesman. So I think that's something we would maybe encourage your listeners, is that part of the story, and people like that. There is this creative aspect of selling, which is, moving, as Susanna mentioned, sort of hearts and minds, and figuring out things that are beyond, data and beyond, the obvious, product feature and benefit. And this guy is a master.
Yeah, and I think that at least based on my reading of his story, and so on too, is that. But he was telling a sort of specific story, and one that I emphasize a lot when I'm working with sellers, is that there is this emphasis on becoming a storyteller, but these days everybody wants to give sellers stories to tell, and the most effective story, as you referred to, is the story of the person listening to you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you can help them envision what success is for them. Mm-hmm. I always think back to this quote from John Steinbeck. He says, if the story isn't about the listener or the reader, then they're not going to be interested. Paraphrasing it, but I think that's such a critical thing when you're trying to do something new. Is you have to put the person in the frame, right? It has to be their story of success.
It's called the WIFM, right? The what's in it for me.
Yeah, to some degree, yeah.
Yeah, you need to actually put the user first and tell them why they need to care.
Exactly. All right. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. But so if people want to learn more about your book and connect with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, they can find the book on Amazon. So again, it's called The Entrepreneur's Faces: How Makers, Visionaries, and Outsiders Succeed. We also have a website, theentrepreneur'sfaces.com, which I, as a maker, built, and I built a little quiz there where you can find out your own type, and then share that with us, or share that with other people on social media. And of course, we're on LinkedIn and we're on Twitter.
Yeah, we write a lot. We're writing for Startup Nation, a number of other publications. So we would like to tell more great sales stories. So maybe something to your audiences. We'd like to hear, a creative or just, heartwarming or successful sales story. And we think it's going to be an amazing time in the coming months in terms of business.
Excellent. All right, Jonathan, Susanna, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Andy.
Thanks,
it was
Andy.
Wonderful to be here.
Okay, friends, that's it for this episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. I'm ever so grateful for your support of this program. And I want to thank my guests, Jonathan Littman and Susanna Camp, for sharing their insights with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you could also leave us a rating or review and let us know how we're doing, well, we'd appreciate that. And you can do all that on your phone in less than a minute as soon as this episode is over. So thank you for your help, and thank you so much for investing your time with me today. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.